Welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Greetings. Happy to be here with you. I have a guest that I've known about this man for actually, I think, longer than he's known about me. I think 12, 13 years ago, I first learned about Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum over at Idaho State University. And he is, well, I'll find out, but I think he is certainly one of the world's leading experts in the study of Sasquatch, also known as Bigfoot. I learned that is not his preferred word for that phenomenon, but of course, just like with UFOs, we can't always choose what people know about. Dr. Jeff Meldrum is a full professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University since 1993. He teaches human anatomy in graduate health professions programs. His expertise is really impressive here, and I won't go over all of it, but he is the co-editor of a volume called From Biped to Strider, The Emergence of Modern Human Walking, Running, and Resource Transport. There's a lot more here. Jeffrey Meldrum houses well over 300 footprint casts attributed to the mystery primate known as Sasquatch. I think there's a great deal more, but I'm excited to just jump right in. And Dr. Meldrum, Jeff, it's a pleasure to have you on the Richard Dolan Show. Thank you.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, I actually had my first, I learned about you for a television show that I briefly did back in 2006 called Sci-Fi Investigates. And you probably don't even remember doing an interview for that. But one of our people did interview you, and it was an episode we did called Bigfoot.
Yeah.
And but what was interesting about it is I personally learned quite a bit about the Sasquatch mystery. And I really want to hear you talk about this, but I'll just say I spoke to a number of Sasquatch witnesses at that time. This was in Oregon, lots of forest out there. And all I'll say is that those individuals struck me very much like UFO witnesses. They sounded pretty much exactly the same to me. And I've interviewed so many folks who've interviewed UFOs, things that they don't know how to explain. And yet there it is. And I spoke to one Sasquatch witness. I would say he was probably a 35-year-old hunter, outdoorsman, a very straightforward sort of a guy, in my opinion. And he said he encountered this creature. He got to within about 60 feet of it. And I'm thinking that's the distance from a pitcher to home plate. It's not that far. There's a creature at a stream. Looked like it was getting some water, and they looked at each other, and I, of course, was devil's advocate. I said, well, how do you know it wasn't a bear? He said, well, two things. This was brown, and we don't have brown bears. And the other thing is it wasn't a bear. I don't know what to tell you, he said, but it stood upright. It looked right at him, scared him to death, and he just slowly backed away. But I believed him. You know, how could I not? But I would love to hear you talk about this mystery. You've got a lot of expertise in human anatomy, and I'm sure that figures into your research with the Sasquatch mystery. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it does. From my position of experience and expertise, it's the footprint evidence that had first drew me into this question, from an academic point of view, at least. And so it was the opportunity to examine fresh footprints in the ground, an exceptional case of footprints that really set the hook, that drew me in, and you know, I couldn't walk away from it. I really couldn't. And so now that was back in 1996, and so here all these years later, and as you pointed out, 300 footprint casts later, and many other photographic examples of footprints and footprint casts from various quarters of the continent and the world, for that matter, in terms of other possible relic hominoids. I'm quite convinced that there is a very good case to be made for the persistence, for the existence of these relic populations of be they apes or early hominins, living alongside us, sharing the planet with us. Very rare, very elusive. I mean, we have almost fulfilled the textbook description of dominating a planet and driven all of our cohorts in the hominidae to extinction. But Sometimes extinction is something that comes about rather slowly for very persistent species that hang on in remote, out-of-the-way places with very few numbers.
I think Neanderthals hung on in a similar way for quite a few centuries in Western Europe before they finally went away. What is it about the physiological evidence in the footprints that strikes you as, thinking that this is real, other than something that could have been forged, for example?
Right. Well, they're more than just simply enlarged facsimiles of a human footprint. I mean, that would be the most straightforward explanation you might think, if someone just enlarging a human foot shape to make a gigantic footprint, or as we've seen in real life, individuals contriving some very crude and odd-looking carved wooden feet in order to stomp out footprints. The footprints that are by far in the majority, and this is an important point, that the obvious, transparent hoaxes, in my mind, are very few and far between. I mean, much more common are misidentifications, overinterpreting a pothole or a footprint shaped impression in the ground, just an isolated, singular, artifact, or misidentifying other forms of wildlife like bear, which are also relatively plantigrade and have 5 digits and so forth. The vast majority are remarkably distinct, and there are distinctions that contrast these footprints with the human condition in ways that are absolutely consistent and logical and sound adaptations for a bipedal creature of immense weight, negotiating the rugged, mountainous, forested terrain that they are reportedly inhabiting. And it's that congruence, it's that naturalness, that spontaneity of adaptation that is for me so compelling.
Wow. I'm wondering, there's one little bit of physiological, like a marker, I suppose, in the footprints that I learned about, and it has to do with what's called the metatarsal ridge. I'm sure you're very deeply aware of this, obviously. And it was my understanding that that's a very difficult thing to fake in a footprint in the wild. Is that true? And could you explain that a little bit?
Well, right. The recognition of that feature actually originated with me. It comes in large part because of my background in the adaptations of bipedalism in early hominins, in comparison and contrast to the condition of the foot, the grasping hominoid foot of the chimp, gorilla, and so forth. Early on in the study of chimpanzee foot function, a researcher by the name of Hicks had described what he called the metatarsal break, or the mid-tarsal break. Now, by break, he means not a dysfunction or a damage, a trauma, but rather an axis of flexion. Something breaks or folds along an axis of flexion. And he was referring to the marked flexibility of the midfoot, which is an adaptation of grasp climbing apes that grab onto that substrate with their hindfoot, much as we would grab on with our hand. Well, in order for the foot still to have that propulsive function, there has to be a little bit of decoupling of the prehensile half from the propulsive half. And that occurs across the mid-tarsal joint, which is actually 2 joints.
Okay.
It's the joint between the talus, the ankle bone, and the navicular, and the cuboid and the calcaneus. And so the foot twists and flexes at that joint. Now we have that same pair of joints. It's just that in humans, modern Homo sapiens have adapted their foot as a much stiffer, more rigid platform for more efficient propulsion. We no longer need the prehensile capacity. And so that part of the foot has been co-opted
For people who don't know, prehensile simply means you grab with it.
Yeah.
So you can grab with your apes can grab with their toes, and we really can't, unless you're really talented, I suppose.
Well, right.
Most people can't.
Yes, I mean, actually, that ability is latent to a large degree. I mean, the opposite to the big toe, but the prehensile capability is latent. And there are examples of individuals, say, born without upper extremities, who develop a remarkable dexterity in their feet.
Oh, right.
Even the ability to dress themselves, to eat, to write and paint, and so forth. So anyway, the point simply is that this mid-tarsal break is a more primitive characteristic, one that precedes the emergence of the stiff longitudinal arch of the human foot, which is an adaptation for more efficient propulsion in endurance walking and running, basically, especially running. It's a running adaptation. So so understanding, first of all, just the very nature of that, its presence, recognizing its presence and what the significance is something that most people wouldn't have any ken, they wouldn't have any knowledge of, let alone understand it sufficiently to incorporate it consistently into fake feet.
And so these metatarsal ridge impressions are typically in the Bigfoot or the Sasquatch, prints that you have observed.
Well, in many examples, it's not present 100% of the time because the foot is very flat and flexible, and depending on the nature of the substrate, the ridge is a secondary feature that occurs as the footfall progresses through this dynamic cycle. And when the heel is elevated and the foot flexes, weight concentrated over the forefoot, that will sometimes then displace material back into the heel, which is no longer compacted since the heel is up in the air. To the heel impression, I should say. And so if the substrate is compliant or will yield, if there's enough forward impulse, then you get that combination of factors that generates that secondary artifact. Otherwise, many of the footprints look remarkably flat. If the knees have twisted or the foot is twisted in a supination way, we have these movements called supination and pronation of the hand, and they also apply to the foot. So a foot that is pronated is pressed down very flat. The arch is lowered. Excuse me. When the foot is supinated, the medial aspect of the longitudinal arch is raised up. Now, in a Sasquatch, in a chimp, that's a transient phenomenon, that movement. In humans, we don't have that same degree of range of movement. We do to a certain degree, but the range is limited tremendously by the configuration of the joints. Anyway, so in Sasquatch tracks, sometimes we get them, they're remarkably flat. They look almost flat as a pancake, like the two casts that Roger made at the film site. The researchers, of the times looked at that, the anthropologists and anatomists like John Napier, and said, they look like carved flat wooden feet made these. They were so featureless as far as topography. But when you examine other examples from that same trackway, those cast by Bob Titmus, a large number of them show to varying degrees this mid-tarsal pressure ridge. One in particular shows it in a very marked fashion, and that was what drew my attention to this.
Interesting. So that so it seems like that would be a very difficult thing to consistently fabricate, even with the right kind of footwear that might try to mimic that. That seems to be very much your point.
Sure, and others have tried. Some have tried that before, and they think that they've demonstrated that it can happen, but
they can't.
They're examples. Only the inconsistency of their examples only betray how ignorant they are of the actual underlying anatomy and so forth.
That makes sense. This is consistent with what I thought I knew, so I'm glad that you explained that, and I think viewers and listeners appreciate that. So when you look at, and these footprints, they're huge, by the way. That's why they call it Bigfoot. They're enormous. The first one you studied, at least in reading your bio, was about 15 inches. That's pretty big. there's some that are much, much larger than that. And when you extrapolate out the size of these creatures, these beings, are we talking 7, 8 feet high, more?
Oh, yes. Yeah, definitely. Anywhere from, I would say, from 7 to even 10 feet at the outer limit, so to speak.
Yeah, it's astonishing.
But sure, I think that the average that who was it? Dr. Henner Fehrenbach did some statistical analysis, and I think his average was 16.5 inches for Sasquatch tracks, and that would probably equate to something in the 8.5 foot range. Yeah.
Right. That's quite extraordinary. So, but not only are people like yourself studying the footprints, there are, I assume, other forms of evidence. There's visual sightings, which I guess we can get into, but there's also other types of evidence like broken branches, I think, and one person demonstrator showed how a tree branch just seemed to have been twisted,
right,
by some unbelievable amount of strength, and it didn't seem that there was any evidence that it was a kind of machinery or a tool or equipment having been used. Are you familiar with this type of evidence, I assume?
Yes. There was a spat of occurrences of such twist-offs or tree breaks in the Blue Mountains outside of Walla Walla, Washington, at one point, and I came into possession of a large number of examples of that. One of the most impressive, which I didn't ultimately get, was, it must have been 3.5, 4 inches in diameter, the trunk, and you could actually see in the bark where the fingers had gripped and then bent and twisted, and it wasn't just bent over and broken at an angle. It was bent and twisted so that the fibers of the tree trunk just literally exploded and were bent and twisted around. But most impressive even was the impressions of the fingertips that were outlined by little beads of sap that had bled up through the bruised bark on this tree trunk. It just now when it comes to those kinds of things and the so-called tree structures, the teepee structures and the X's and this, that, and that, I'm still remain rather skeptical on the vast majority of these. I think many witnesses are reading just too much into just what are natural deadfalls. And I always, my admonition is, you need to, well, one thing is you can dissect. You can work your way backward and see how such an accumulation might have occurred naturally. If there are root wads still attached, if they're still, planted in the ground but tipped over, etc. But the ultimate test is, I think there really needs to be associative evidence. There needs to be such a thing with footprints beside it, or with hair entangled in the bark and branches.
Oh, yes.
Those things that have been. And in the absence of those, we really don't know. We really don't know what the provenience, what the origin of those artifacts is. And so it's even one more degree of removal from the prima facie evidence of the creature itself. So I think we need to tread carefully in that regard.
It's got to be frustrating for you as a scientist. You get what seems to me like tantalizing evidence that something real is going on here, which is of really, I would say, profound significance, in the sense that if this is right, we've got an entire significant creature, a hominid, that is living among us. That's enormous, and all of this, and yet the quality of the evidence, while not insignificant, is also, you would like to have corroborative and associative evidence together. And I'm gathering that that doesn't happen very, like you don't get footprints with hair samples or other types of DNA samples or anything like this?
On rare occasions, and unfortunately, when you mentioned DNA, we've yet to pin down any DNA sample to date. And this has raised an interesting question, one that is on the forefront of my list of New Year's resolutions, I guess you could say, my research goals for the coming year, and that's the advent, not the advent, but rather the advances in and more availability of eDNA techniques, environmental DNA. One of the
that's interesting.
Yeah, and that's where you take samples of soil or water or even air, and using a cadre of primers, you can probe for all of the DNA contributors in that environment who have left their traces in that sample. And it's remarkable how it's very sensitive. But and we did apply this recently to some interesting samples taken from possible Sasquatch nests that were identified in the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State. And unfortunately, the only primate that was identified was labeled as human. And this raised in my mind a question that has been there, it resurrected a question that's been lingering for quite some time in my mind. And that is, what are the odds of our having false negatives? In other words, saying that something is not Sasquatch when in fact it is, and identifying it instead as a human, because such a little narrow piece of DNA has been examined.
Yeah, we shared most of our DNA with apes and chimpanzees.
Exactly.
And presumably we would be more closely related to a Sasquatch, I would imagine.
Very
so it could be very difficult indeed. That's a good question. So, and hopefully our DNA science might progress a little bit between now and the next decade or two, but still that's not a magic bullet.
Right. We have the tools. It's the cost right now. It's the because in order to do it properly, you need an entire mitochondrial genome and a significant selection of nuclear genes in order to really say, absolutely, this is human, as opposed to being something that's very human-like. And so I think as the costs continue to come down, and as we focus our proposal and have samples like this nest, that or set of nests, series of nests, that this kind of a sample has much higher probability of yielding potentially Sasquatch DNA, because we can't imagine what else constructed these nests. I mean, we're as confident as we can be otherwise.
What are these nests like? How can you describe them?
Yeah, they were very interesting. They look like a big bird's nest. I mean, it's like it's not just a heap of forest duff and debris and bark and such, like a bear would scrape together to just make a mound that it would then pack down in order to provide itself with some insulation from the cold, damp ground. Instead, there was a real structure to these things. We actually dissected one. We took a pie wedge-shaped cut out of one of the nests right down to the ground, and what we found was that there was an understructure of branches that were laid out haphazardly, but just it created a platform on which then debris was piled, and then all the surrounding these evergreen blueberries that are about 7 feet tall, all of the top 6-inch, the green growth, the spriggers were snapped off, and that was woven, not piled, but woven in to create this nest with a raised lip around the outer edge, and one that.
How high was the wall of the nest? It was on the ground, I assume.
They were on the ground, yeah. And the whole nest, I mean, obviously they were compacted with age and deterioration too. Obviously, when they were first discovered, they were fresh enough that the greenery was still, the leaves were attached to the branches. When I was out and saw them 2 years later, then that had all fallen off, and you just had this what looked much more like a bird's nest. But I mean, we're talking, a foot to 18 inches tall of material and debris piled on. So it was quite astounding. And there was a collection of these and some interesting circumstances. I mean, just the way they were arranged, one would have to ask, and this is, speculative, putting on my speculation cap here, but why, there have been other supposed nests and described, but it's a pretty rare instance of encountering such, and nothing quite like this that I'm familiar with. So what's the singular event that would prompt this? Well, one of the interesting little asides was, amongst the nests, there was a smaller nest. It was only about 2 feet across, that had been built not on the ground, but up in the crown of a bush, about 2 feet off the ground. And I looked at that and I thought, immediately the thought was, that looks like a bassinet. looks like a little cradle.
Oh.
And so I'm wondering if the singular event that brought this multiple individuals apparently together and the construction of a more permanent encampment, so to speak, was a birthing event.
How amazing that would be.
Wouldn't that be something? So,
It's an incredible thing. Like we think of, people will talk about Bigfoot, and it's such an embedded, it's so embedded in popular myth and culture. But there are people like yourself who are actually digging into the details of what this creature might actually be, and the fact that it would have a life and
right.
children and offspring and mates and its own adventures. And like, what would that be like living in a world dominated by human beings? It's really an incredible thing to think about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a very important perspective too. In fact, but the theme of my speaking engagements for the past year has been conversations on the behavioral ecology of Sasquatch. In other words, what are some of the inferences that provide insight into the adaptations? If this were just if this were some paranormal phenomenon, this was some interdimensional being or spirit being that's come from another realm, then one would think it would look out of place in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. It would just be an interloper. It would be a creature that originated, evolved, or adapted elsewhere. But that's not the case from my perspective as a biologist and anthropologist. As you so astutely pointed out, as you dig into this, what you find is that there are numerous examples. I mean, everything about it attests to the fact that it evolved and adapted in this particular place. It's at home in this place, and it behaves like any other animal as far as its basic biology, its need for shelter, for food, etc. But cast in the mold of a large bipedal primate instead of a bear or a cougar or an elk.
Right. There's a number of things that I would love to follow up in terms of the evidence for this, and I see you've got an image of the Patterson film behind you there. I would love to ask about that, but as I mentioned before we began recording, in the UFO field, I've occasionally encountered. I've gone to conferences where there'll be researchers in the Sasquatch / Bigfoot phenomenon. I'm on very friendly terms with Stan Gordon, who I'm sure you know of Stan, and there's a number of others that I've encountered, and I've noticed that there seems to be a rift. There's probably a lot of rifts in this field of study, just like there are in any other. But there's definitely a group of people who seem to indicate that the Sasquatch phenomenon is related to more paranormal, or even we'll say UFO type phenomenon. And there's definitely the naturalists, which sounds like that's what you are, who are saying, look, this is simply an Earth developed creature, and like a lot of animals on Earth, we just haven't really confirmed its existence fully, but we believe that's what this is. And I suspect that this is something that goes on in your field. And I met a gentleman a year or two ago at an event, and he gave me a book. I wish I could find it, about how Bigfoot ambassador from the galaxy or something like that. And so there's that whole thing out there.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And you have to deal with that. So what is that like for you to have to deal with? You just push it aside, or do you listen to these people? Is there an argument there? In the case of Stan, I just will say he did a very interesting study on the year 1973 in Western Pennsylvania, where he combined. There's a lot of UFO accounts, without a doubt, in Western PA at that time, but also apparently a lot of Sasquatch sightings, and he believed that there was a correlation. Do you have thoughts about this type of a thing? I
Well,
don't mean to put you on the spot, but figured
yeah,
why.
that's fine. No, I'm put on the spot all the time with this, so it's no. Yeah, I'm not intimately familiar with Stan's argument, what data he has marshaled to go from a correlation to a causal relationship. And
Mhm.
there is a distinction there, obviously.
Sure, yeah.
Distinction. And I can remember way back in the 70s when I was reading some of those Saga magazine articles about the UFO and Bigfoot connection. And oftentimes the descriptions of Bigfoot were very distinct and different. I mean, there you often got the glowing red eyes, you got three-toed and three-fingered creatures and things that were quite variant from the typical description of Bigfoot. Now, whether that is accurate, I can't say. And I can only go on based on my own personal experience. And quite frankly, when people who make such claims, in some instances where they have been provided supposed evidence of their experiences, the evidence never stands up. I mean, it really doesn't. I mean, there was a conversation online about orbs, and someone then, a prominent individual in this conversation, posted this photograph. And here are all these little, taken at night with a flash camera. And here are all these little dots. Well, I've been out. I was this past summer, we were out in the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah.
And it was at the peak, unfortunately, of the ponderosa pine pollination. Pollen was blowing everywhere. And when you put on your little headlamp and turn that thing on, it looked like the entire night sky was full of orbs of light, as this pollen would catch that flashlight beam and light up. And that's all this was. It was dust and particles in the air. I've been out with individuals who claim all sorts of experiences, having bumps in the night, having feelings, having all this. And quite frankly, whenever I'm along, I guess I'm the party crasher, nothing happens.
Yeah.
I mean, literally nothing happens. And so I'm not going to pass ultimate judgment on these individuals and their experiences. It's just that I've never, I don't have, I'm like, and this will date me, but if you'll remember that hamburger commercial, the little old lady in the hamburger shops opening up the bun saying, "Where's the beef?" Where's the beef? That's my.
You and I both remember that one. So.
So I just don't see it right now.
Well, part of the attraction, at least from my perspective, is that the Sasquatch phenomenon is so elusive, and I think a lot of folks would think, well, heck, why can't we just figure this out? What is it about them? And then you have stories of other types of cryptids. Lauren Coleman over in Portland, Maine, has got his really awesome museum. I visited there a couple of years ago and took a big picture with a replica of a Sasquatch, actually. But there's definitely people who are attracted to one, let's say, fringe topic are going to probably bump into a lot of other fringe topics, and so that's just, I guess, how it is. And then you hear about crazy places like the Skinwalker Ranch in Utah, where a lot of bizarre activities have been reported. I was just recently looking into that myself again. And so, I mean, I'm, at least personally, this doesn't have to count for you, but I'm very much open to possibilities that we live in a little bit of a stranger world than perhaps we've been led to believe. But I take your point. You're only seeing biological evidence here. You're really not seeing anything beyond that.
And I agree with you that there are things that certainly are beyond our normal experience. I mean, I'm quite open to that. I guess from a philosophical point of view, from science, philosophy of science point of view, we proceed by taking the simplest explanation first, the simplest hypothesis, and attempting to falsify that. And so for me, the simplest is, the one that doesn't stand as a glaring exception to the rest of the natural world, is that this is a biological species. And so far, all the evidence seems to align with that. I'm not to the point even acknowledging the elusiveness of the phenomenon, as you point out, which I think the common denominator for most of those contentions is simply the rarity. When you reflect on the fact that almost all encounters are serendipitous, they're not intentional. They're not by people who go out with the object of encountering the Sasquatch, the credible ones, the substantiated, corroborated ones, but they're serendipitous. But if you go from that point, and so far, I say I've not been able to discount that as the explanation. Now, a lot of people who are less steeped in the rigors of science and objectivity and rationality, they give up much more quickly and say, in the face of that elusiveness, and say there must be another reason that goes beyond the biological. And so for them, even if it's not based on personal experience, it's sort of a resignation, a throwing in the towel that, well, there must be something else to this. So they turn to the paranormal explanations. But that's just my read, and that's just my opinion.
I'm glad I asked you about this, so you had a chance to explain this position as well as you did. I appreciate it, and I agree with you. I think with any of these unusual phenomena we're dealing with, we want to approach it scientifically, and I do agree. Using principles of Occam's razor and what is the simplest, least cluttered explanation for something that makes the most sense. So I think that makes a lot of sense, the way you explained it. Can we talk about some of the other more well-known elements of the Sasquatch controversy or exist, like the Patterson film, which you have in your office, and there are some other films as well that I know exist and have been analyzed. I saw one, I think from the 1990s, that showed a creature running over a field. And I don't know if you've seen this one, but someone showed it to me. And I've seen a number of other films, some that I don't think have been out on the internet, that showed one allegedly was legit, and it looked, boy, did it look like a very real Sasquatch. But again, I don't know how to judge the legitimacy of some of these. But can you talk about some of the video or film evidence that exists?
Right. Well, as you point out, the Patterson-Gimlin film.
This is the famous one from 1967, I believe. That's
correct. The one that you always see when it walks across the screen from left to right. And that one is by far the benchmark. It, in quality, duration, conditions, it has set the bar so high that and yet remained extremely controversial.
Right.
That bears a consideration when, as far as the implications for considering every other that come up far short as far as quality and duration and visibility and so forth.
What makes a Patterson film so strong?
Well, as I said, it was shot on 16 millimeter film instead of video, where digital enhancement, hoaxing, and so forth is much more difficult. I mean, it's inconceivable on the original, really, in my mind. But I mean, modifications or enhancements or alterations could be imposed on things perhaps later, but it and the, as I said, the duration and the visibility. It's not this fleeting little furry object darting back through the trees with just affording glimpses of anatomy here and there. Then you have the whole Monty right there walking in front of you, and you can examine it from the crown of its head to the tip of its last little pinky toe. It subjects itself to significant criticism and scrutiny that way, but it stands up to that, and especially from a position of someone like me as a comparative primate anatomist and a student of human and non-human primate locomotion, it stands up remarkably well.
All right, this is like right in your expertise. The way that this creature walks,
right,
is in a certain way that makes it seem legitimate to you, rather than just a guy in a monkey suit, which I'm sure is what most people who haven't really studied it would say. But what is it that makes this not a guy in a monkey suit, I suppose?
Well, yeah, like I said, we start at the top and work all the way down. I mean, the anatomy is replete. So The craniofacial anatomy is remarkably distinct. And I guess the thing that makes it to condense it down into one theme here, the thing that is so compelling to me now, this was the theme that I developed and conveyed in my public speaking and writing during that anniversary year, that 50th anniversary year. I mean, here it's 50 years old, 1967, and if you go down through what is actually portrayed, the nature of the creature on that film, it actually anticipates, in some instances by decades, what we now understand about early hominin evolution. Just a simple case in point to illustrate what I mean. Dr. John Napier, who was very sympathetic, very open-minded about the subject of Sasquatch, in 1968, he was one of the team at the Smithsonian that examined the film for the first time, the first showing to experts in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And, he, like his colleagues, were literally unable to acknowledge that this thing was real. It couldn't be real. As far as one of the paradigms of anthropology at that time was what was called the single species hypothesis, that there could be only one species of hominin in that niche at any one time, and at present we're it. So there couldn't be any other bipedal hominins out there. So they were already hamstrung by that preconception.
That's an interesting. I mean, I'm puzzled by that belief, since even then they would have known that humans and Neanderthals had to have lived side by side for at least a certain period of time.
Well, but it was that constant competition. See, the duration of that coexistence wasn't acknowledged at that time. We hadn't found the youngest specimens, nor the oldest.
Okay, right.
Homo sapiens into Europe. So it was thought that it was that principle that drove the Neanderthals to extinction as Homo sapiens pressed their way into Western Europe.
Okay.
So, in any case, though, the thing that really was kind of almost amusing in hindsight, I mean, for want of a better description, Napier said, I just can't accept this is really said. If you look at the creature on that film, the subject on that film, from the waist up, it looks like an ape, but from the waist down, it looks like a typical human. And he goes, it's almost inconceivable that such a hybrid combination of traits could exist in nature. So it has to be hoaxed. It has to be contrived. Well,
okay.
A year later, that was 1960. Well, he published the book in which that statement was made was in 1973. So about 5 years after viewing the film.
Mm-hmm.
And he that was to his credit. He was the first, one of the first academics, since Ivan Sanderson, who published a book.
I'm a big fan of Ivan Sanderson.
Yeah, it was open-minded, at least, although it was basically ignored by his colleagues. Mm-hmm. But that came out in 1973. In 1974 came the discovery of Lucy and Australopithecus afarensis, with complete enough skeletal material that we could really look at it and see something about its adaptations for bipedalism, that it wasn't just walking around like a chimpanzee, basically.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, Lucy was essentially looked like a chimpanzee, except she walked like a human being.
All right, and
that's the key.
That's the point. When you read those press releases, the scientists are saying, "Isn't this interesting? From the waist up, she looks like a chimp. From the waist down, she looks like a human. Isn't it fascinating how evolution has proceeded in this mosaic fashion?" Well, now wait a minute. What would have happened if Napier had waited a year or two, had written his book a year or two later?
Good question.
That principal argument against the Patterson-Gimlin film would have had the rug pulled right out from underneath its feet.
Yeah.
So the film, again, here as in many other instances of adaptation, what you see on that film is a remarkably accurate representation of a admittedly gigantic, now increased in size, but an early bipedal hominin, a non-tool using hominin akin to an Australopithecine or a Paranthropine, And so how could Roger Patterson, a supposed ne'er-do-well, rodeo rider in Yakima, Washington, the backwaters of Yakima, Washington, have concocted something that that the experts at the time couldn't.
It's that good. It's that good.
Not just one coincidence, but dozens of coincidences that he got right. He predicted correctly.
So what's the deal with other experts in, bipedal locomotion? You're not the only one. There've got to have been other people who have looked at that and thought, wow, that might be really difficult to fake after all. Like, have you gotten other people, even if privately, quietly, to agree that that film seems legitimate?
A few. I mean, the more vocal individual was Dr. David Daglin and his a mutual friend of ours, Dan Schmidt, who did a paper for Skeptical Inquirer and basically argued that it was just a man in a fursuit. But their reductionist approach in some instances, where they would isolate one characteristic and try to demonstrate how a human could mimic that, ignored the whole picture. And when you try to put it all back together, and take into account the disparities in limb proportions and body proportions, the breadth of the pelvis and the breadth of the shoulders, let alone the inordinately long arms and relatively shorter legs that you see on this creature. Mm-hmm. It's also, again, is very much akin to the values for Australopithecines.
I love how Skeptical Inquirer tries to portray themselves as these actual rational skeptics. They're the high priests of establishment power institutions. That's all they are. And it's not even scientific. It's political. It's scientific. It's the whole thing. And that's all that they do. But anyway, go on.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right on that point. And I've tried to beat that drum beat occasionally as well, because once in a while I'll have a colleague here at work who will stick a Xerox copy of an article from the Skeptical Inquirer, something into my box,
In the eye rolling.
Yeah, it's like, if they're this far off on Bigfoot and Sasquatch, how far off are they on every other subject that they tackle?
Very frequently
pontificate upon.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. So that's what for me is so compelling about the Patterson-Gimlin film. I mean, other than just, you can take it at so many levels. You can look at just what you see on the film and dissect the anatomy of that creature. And there's details of anatomy that just are not present in a fursuit, especially a fursuit circa 1967, when they didn't have spandex, when they didn't have four-way stretch fur, when they didn't have foam rubber to build up musculature and so forth. It just the technology of modern day costume design and makeup artistry in the industry was just not present.
Well, and when you think about it, that was also the era of Planet of the Apes movie.
That's right.
Which incidentally had, for its time, really superb costumes for the creatures. I would say
those foam rubber appliances that Chambers made. I mean, that you got him an Oscar for that, and the innovation of that.
Those are amazing. But this is actually more realistic looking.
Oh, absolutely.
The Patterson-Gimlin video film is more realistic. It seems to me.
Much more natural.
It's better.
Yeah. So you've got that bar set so high, and then all these other little, photobombs and squatch blobs and all the other terms that are used to apply to these ambiguous. Anyone by itself. Oh, well, there's a few, like you mentioned. There are a few that are really compelling in their own right, but so many of them are just anyone individually is not very compelling. But when you start to take them together, for a while there was a Facebook page, and I don't know if it's still up there, a Facebook Find Bigfoot, that basically the individuals who ran that, basically they would solicit the submission of these films, and then they would evaluate them. And as over the course of their evaluations, they developed kind of a set of criteria, and they would rank them then according to those criteria. And when you looked at the top 20 films, it was really quite amazing, because like I said, anyone by itself wasn't very compelling. But when you start seeing these same themes and same landmarks, key field marks over and over and over, the way the arm twists and the hand faces, the way the leg is lifted, the way the head sits on the shoulder, etc., then it becomes kind of interesting.
Are
Because
there good resources on the web where people who are interested can look at some of this evidence? I'm not familiar with it, but I'm sure you may be.
well, as I said, I don't know that Facebook page is up any longer. I went after it one more time, and I did. Otherwise, I think if you just and there are several people out there who do evaluations of these kinds of things, and right or wrong, it's a great exercise, I think, to at least consider their arguments and their criteria of evaluation. Thinker Thunker is one that comes to mind that has done some very interesting evaluations, and there are others. My my point is, I honestly, personally, I mean, I'm pulled so many different directions. I don't have the luxury of spending a lot of time on each of these individually and trying to convince myself one way or the other. And when there's a heated debate and conversation over the merits of a particular film like that, I just remind these individuals and remind myself, here's the Patterson-Gimlin film. Your argument's down here. There's all this,
Right.
So what if you convince yourself that it's real? And by that, it may be a long, drawn-out process of convincing yourself. It is just a little ripple in the pond compared to the splash made by the Patterson-Gimlin film, and yet we're still arguing about this 50 years later.
Good grief, I know. Hey, we have less than 5 minutes. We got about 3 minutes left on this, it looks like. And I guess I'll ask you, where is Sasquatch research today? Like, what are the interesting issues going on, and what's the future of this field of research in your view?
Right. Well, I touched on one, and that's, I think, the applications of environmental DNA.
Oh, yes.
And with a well-funded project, the ability to systematically sample different sites of reported Sasquatch activity for any DNA trace in the form of environmental DNA. The second big thrust, I think, is that we need to undertake is eventually the application of drone technology, using aerial survey techniques combined with thermal imaging to cover much larger areas in a systematic fashion. Because, as I pointed out, encounters are usually serendipitous. It's not like I can go out and set traps or do a transect through the forest and collect data about Sasquatch. It's the proverbial moving needle in a haystack. And that has to do with their rarity compared to any other creature out there, being that they're long-lived, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those are the two areas that I see and expect to anticipate in my own participation in.
Well, this must be true. There's still enormous tracts of forest and relatively inaccessible places on this planet. I suppose we still forget. We have a huge population, but there are many, many areas. Look at the Pacific Northwest, even go north of the border into Canada. That's an enormous, all of British Columbia is just fabulously huge. And there's not a lot of people out in those more remote areas. So I imagine it could be relatively easier than we think for a creature to live undisturbed.
Right.
I imagine.
People are concentrating more in the urban centers.
Right.
And urban and suburban, they're fewer in the rural, fewer people making a living as fur trappers and prospectors and loggers and so forth. And so, yeah, there's a lot of area.
There's so many more questions I want to ask you, Jeff, and actually, hopefully, I'll be able to do that. But for this segment, I think we should wrap this up. So I just want to let people know: is there a way that they can follow your research? Should they go to the Idaho State University website, or is there a site that you have for yourself that you'd like to direct people?
I don't have a web page of my own, but I do edit an online journal, which is called the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, and it is hosted by the ISU server. So it's isu.edu/RHI, and there are it provides a venue for professional scholarly articles, book reviews, commentaries, editorials, and so forth. As any professional journal would. That's one good place. And then, as as far as activities and speaking engagements, field operations, so forth, I usually put things up on Facebook every now and again. So Don Jeffrey Meldrum on Facebook.
We're going to look for you. Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, I really want to thank you for this time here on the Richard Dolan Show. It's been fascinating. I'm so glad we had the opportunity to talk about this, and you explained your research so very well. I think a lot of folks are interested in what you have to say on this. I certainly found it eye-opening. So that concludes my interview with Dr. Jeff Meldrum. If you want to hear us continue this conversation, you can go to my website at richarddolanmembers.com, where Dr. Meldrum and I are going to go a little bit further. I've got a few other questions I want to ask. But for now, that's got to be it. Jeff, thank you so very much.
You're quite welcome. Thank you.